Hello, my name is Soraya Toronto, and I am Chief of Staff for Goldman Sachs Engineering in Salt Lake City, where more than 500 engineering employees and 250 of our contract staff are based. We are longtime supporters of Silicon Slopes and their work to build Utah's tech community, and we are thrilled at the opportunity to undertake this Tech Talk series in partnership with Silicon Slopes. I wanted to share a little bit about why we're doing this. Our aim is to share learnings and highlights from our engineers' work, which will hopefully be of interest and value to engineers at other organizations. And I should say that at Goldman Sachs, the term engineer includes software developers, quantitative engineers, infrastructure engineers, data stewards, cybersecurity professionals, and application and user support professionals. In Salt Lake City, our engineers build and support applications across our trading and asset management businesses, as well as for internal functions such as risk and corporate treasury. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn with questions or suggestions about this series that we're kicking off today. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Nicole O'Meara. An Iowa transplant to Salt Lake City, Nicole joined Goldman Sachs during the second week of the COVID-19 shutdown, which means she's coming up on 1 year with us, and we're so thrilled to have her. She's a technical writer who believes everyone can write. She championed this idea at GoDaddy, where she was the editor for the Everybody Writes pilot program. These days, she's passionate about docs as code and eliminating roadblocks to creating great docs. And before I turn it over to Nicole, a quick note about format. As Nicole speaks, you are welcome to submit questions that you might have for her in the comments section of the platform you're viewing this on. Nicole will be happy to answer questions after she is done speaking. And so with that, Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Soraya. So my name's Nicole O'Meara, and I'm a vice president and lead technical writer in developer relations at Goldman Sachs. And over the last 10 years, I've worked at various roles in tech, and documentation has been a huge part of all of them. As Soraya mentioned, I believe that everybody can and should write. And as part of that, I am very focused on training SMEs on how to contribute to content, set up review processes for documentation, and help reduce documentation drift. At the firm, I'm part of a team that's rolling out a DocOps model to all of our development teams. So today, I'm going to talk to you about DocOps, also known as documentation operations, and how you can create better documentation with the tools that you already use. Here's a general overview of what I'll be talking about today: what life looks like before DocOps, the debate about whether docs belong as part of a project or part of their own project, what DocOps is, how to implement it, and some best practices. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, but you're free to ask questions on the platform that you're viewing this on, and that'll be moderated later on. So, life before DocOps. Let's dive right in. I would tell you to raise your hand if you've encountered any of these, but since our format's a little bit different due to COVID, I'm going to talk to you about some problems that I've seen industry-wide, and I'm guessing that some of them will resonate with you. Life before DocOps means dealing with a lot of problems, including no centralized location or standardized format for developer docs. Docs have way too much content or none at all. End users can't find what they need because documentation is scattered between multiple platforms without a unified search. There are never enough writers. And docs are often created reactively to address a problem rather than proactively to accompany release cycles. Because of this, the developer docs are almost always out of date because of continuous release cycles. So, what if I told you that there's a better way to handle documentation, and that as a developer, you're already using most of the tools necessary to do so? Docs can be treated like code. Developers and product managers can write docs. They can be easily tied to your release cycles. End users can find the documentation that they're looking for and self-service the information that they need. And you can revolutionize the way that your company handles developer docs and reduce drift at the same time. Now, I'm going to talk about the big debate. where should your developer docs live? There are two schools of thought. Either your docs should be part of the project or they should be part of their own project. So your first option is to treat docs as part of your project. Store them in a docs folder inside of your application source repo. From there, you can build your guides and tutorials from the docs folder, and then any reference materials, such as API specs, can be built from code comments in the source folder. There are some major advantages to this. Documentation and application source remain in lockstep, and developers are more likely to contribute to documentation since the doc files are in the same environment as their code. Additionally, since documentation is tied to the product team's release cycle, that means that your product team can't release a new version until the docs are updated. On the other side of the debate, you can treat docs as their own separate project, independent from source code. In this case, you'd be building documentation from two separate places, guides and tutorials from the documentation repo, and reference materials from the code comments in the source repo. In this case, documentation for platforms is easy to handle, and releases to guides and tutorials can happen independently of product releases. However, developers are less likely to contribute to docs since the docs folder isn't in the same place as their code source, and you end up with a higher risk of documentation drift. Now, documentation drift is a tech writer's nightmare, and it takes place when code releases are pushed without updating the documentation. If you've ever had to Google how to do something because the docs are totally out of date, you've experienced documentation drift. Now, let's talk about some considerations when it comes to rolling out a DocOps model. What does good documentation look like? Good documentation empowers and it never frustrates. Quality can be hard to measure and quantify, but it can still be measured by addressing the following guidelines. Documentation is inviting and clear, it's comprehensive, it's organized and easy to skim, it offers real-world examples on how to use the product, documentation is up-to-date and trustworthy, it's easy to contribute to, and it's easy to find. So these things all come together as one to create good documentation. So what's in it for me? If you care about your product, you need to document it so that others will too. You can make the coolest thingamajig in the whole world, but if it's not clear on how to use it and there's no documentation accompanying it, other developers aren't going to find it useful and they aren't going to take the time to figure it out. So documentation is part of your product's brand. Good documentation brings a number of benefits: improved customer retention, reduced onboarding time, increased sales and adoption, reduced support overhead, reduced reliance on tribal knowledge, which is a huge thing to take care of, and then increased enjoyment in the overall experience. It's way better to go to one doc site, search for what you're looking for and find it instead of having to search across multiple platforms and hope that you're finding something that's correct. So now I'm going to talk about DocOps and how we've taken lessons from DevOps and are translating them to documentation. So, time to answer the big question: what is DocOps? DocOps lets teams create and maintain documentation using the same principles as DevOps. Content creation isn't siloed to technical writers, and release cycles are dependent on docs. So within DocOps, we follow a docs as code model, and we make use of familiar development tools and techniques, including Markdown for content, Git for version control, CI/CD, open API specs for REST APIs, and code reviews include documentation reviews. So instead of having technical writers on every team, we have a centralized documentation team that provides expertise and guidance to developers and SMEs, and they're available for one-off questions or longer engagements to get a doc site up and running. So why should we change the way that we've been handling documentation? Because with DocOps, as a developer, I'm making my documentation changes inside the same commit as my source code changes. Similarly, as a code reviewer, I'm making sure that the docs are updated when I'm reviewing code. DocOps allows companies to expand documentation at scale because while everyone wants a technical writer, not everyone wants to pay for one. So when you implement DocOps, you set up tools and frameworks to automate as much of the documentation process as possible. Some of these tools include templates, linters, and standards, which allow everyone to write without straying away from the style standards that have been set for your documentation. So once you make the change to DocOps, it's time to start treating your docs as code. Documentation source files sit in the same repo as your application source code. Developers, project managers, and technical communicators work together to make sure the documentation is maintained in lockstep with software releases. So when this happens, your reference documentation is highly automated, your handwritten content is streamlined as much as possible, and all of the content is tested and validated as part of the CI/CD pipeline. Together, all of this treats your documentation in a docs as code model. So, standards and implementation. How do we make this work? DocOps requires a pretty basic recipe. For your ingredients, you pick a markup language and a folder structure, and then you choose a template type that works for your scenario. You'll need a CI/CD pipeline and a portal. Implement them with your DevOps team, streamline documentation at scale, and profit. Okay, so it might not be that easy, but now I'm going to talk about how the ingredients work together to make this work. So let's talk docs formats. For written guides, including developer guides, tutorials, and release notes, you can use Markdown, ASCII doc, or a markup language of your choice. Why? There's a low barrier to entry. Most of your developers already know how to use Markdown, so it's not like you're asking them to learn something new. And you can see in this table between the difference in Markdown syntax, HTML, and how it looks in the browser. Because we're using Markdown syntax, it's way easier to just get things formatted and looking good. Now, with reference content, you're going to use industry standard tooling. For REST APIs, I'm going to use OpenAPI. For Java, I'd use JavaDoc. Python, I'd use Sphinx. Same thing goes for all of the different languages that are out there and the reference tooling that's available. So, folder structure. Keep it simple. Docs belong in a docs folder inside your application repo. Why? Because when they're in the same place, you're more likely to update them at the same time. Over to the right, we have what an example repo structure looks like with mkdocs. You can see that the docs folder is sitting in the same repo as the source files, which makes it easy to update both at the same time. Sorry, one sec. Did not mean to skip ahead. Okay. Templates, why should you use them? Most developers aren't writers, which means that when they look at a blank page, nothing happens. Templates give you a standard format to write in, which helps give your doc site a consistent look and feel. And on top of that, they take less time to train to because you can have notes on how to use your templates inside of them. Now, over to the right, we've got a sample template, and you can see that there's information on what to use this for, and then more information on how to fill it out. So we make it as easy as possible for our developers to contribute to our documentation base. We also have a bunch of different template types available. Sometimes you're going to need to explain things in a step-by-step manner for a tutorial. Sometimes you're going to have concepts that are just general information that people need to know. Either way, having the templates available for your developers makes it much easier for them to contribute to your documentation base. Now, CI/CD pipelines. CI/CD pipelines take over a lot of the automation for docs. By using linters, your spelling, grammar, and style standards are easily enforced, and authors can get immediate feedback on the quality of their documentation. In the future, when you make style changes to your docs, you can update your linters to match. Now, after a successful trip through the pipeline, documentation changes are automatically deployed to the downstream portal. Now, last but not least, you need to have a portal for all this to be displayed on. This is where your end users go to search, find, and read your documentation. There are plenty of static site generators to choose from, and you can use them to read your repos and build your documentation. Now, as a bonus, static site generators allow you to easily update your table of contents and navigation without having to restructure your entire site. Make your changes to your config file, and they'll show up everywhere. When you use a static site generator, your product teams own their docs inside of the repo, but your end users can easily find any of the docs that they need. Findability means usability, and usability means product transparency. Now, here are some of the different ways to recognize success when you've moved to a DocOps model. Developers are writing documentation while the code is still fresh. Documentation is updated with each release. The documentation is current and accessible to end users. End users are efficient and happy because they can self-service the documentation that they need. And fewer support contacts happen as a result of updated documentation. And now just a few best practices to keep in mind when you're rolling out a DocOps model to your team. You want to figure out what your DevOps group is doing first, because if you base your standards off of that, it becomes much easier to implement your DocOps model. And then the other part is you need to start small. Rome wasn't built in a day. Here at Goldman, we have not documented every single process under the sun in a year. We've documented the ones that have a lot of impact. So take a look at what parts of your documentation are the most frequently used, update those, and then go from there. Does anybody have any questions?
Nicole, we thank you, first of all, and we do have an initial question. You talked about templates. So if an organization is doing documentation ops, would they be creating their own templates or their template libraries or samples, or how should an organization be thinking about that?
Typically, you're going to create your own templates because you have different things that you want to make sure are covered within your org. You'll see a lot of websites out there where tutorials typically look the same, and that's just because technical writers tend to structure things very similarly, but you're still going to have things that are caveats or necessary just for your org. So you might start with something that looks similar to what somebody else is doing, but you'll still need to update your templates so that they have everything that you need to cover.
Great, thank you. And another one, you talked about what good documentation looks like and how to recognize success. Are there any empirical ways to measure documentation quality?
There are. It basically depends on whether or not you are taking into account user information and visit information. So in my previous role, we would basically monitor how often a document was getting viewed versus how often it was sending people to support. And we also had metrics available for if the documentation was doing well or if it didn't answer their question. So based on those 4 metrics alone, you can get a pretty good idea as to whether or not the documentation that you've created is useful. And there's all sorts of ways that you can measure that with like Google Analytics or Tableau or various other analytics software that's out there.
Great. And one more, any insights or sort of tips or tricks on how users should be thinking about working with the Markdown templates?
Yeah, I think the first thing is if you've got users that aren't familiar with Markdown, like making sure that they realize that it's not scary to use. It's very similar to structuring an outline in a Word document. So that's the first thing, is making sure that people that aren't familiar with it are comfortable with it. Now, when it comes to just using the templates and being familiar with how to do so, we provide, within our team, we provide not only a user guide, but the templates as well as a support channel. So if you have questions, there's somebody to reach out to. Typically, you're going to have like a documentation champion within your organization who is really super passionate about these things and is more than happy to answer the questions and make sure that things are standardized across the company. So I think the number one thing to do is to identify your documentation champion and have them be in charge of all of this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nicole, for taking the time to talk DocOps with us today. And for those listening, if you have additional questions for Nicole, please feel free to reach out to her at nicole.o'meara@gs.com.